Hi, Jay.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I am well. How are you?
I can't complain. It's getting cold. It's starting to feel like winter here.
You just complained.
That depends on how I feel about winter. I love winter. I embrace winter.
I do too. I think we noted we're both wearing sweaters. We're ready for sweater weather.
Yeah. So let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Jay Michaelson. And you are you have been a seeker, and we're going to talk about your seeking. You've been on a spiritual path a long time. You've written a book about that that's called Enlightenment by Trial and Error. Subtitle is 10 Years on the Slippery Slopes of Jewish Spirituality, Postmodern Buddhism, and Other Heresies. You've also written other books, Evolving Dharma, then a book on sadness and spirituality that I think we actually talked about on this platform, The Gate of Tears. Is that it?
Yep, we did.
That's the name of the book. You've written a lot of books, and you write a lot. You're prolific. You write for the Daily Beast on a regular basis.
My new book is called Why Bob Wright is True.
Why Bob? Thank you for that opportunity to plug my book, Why
You're
Buddhism
welcome.
is True. I should say that your path is somewhat Buddhist in orientation, involves a lot of meditation. You're also, but it goes beyond that. You draw on your Jewish heritage. You're conversant in Vedanta, which is Eastern but not Buddhist. And we'll get into all that stuff. You also have a lot of degrees, don't you? You have a PhD in
Jewish thought, technically, but religious studies. Yep. You and I are, I think, in a competition for overeducated.
No, actually not. All I have is a bachelor's degree. And you also have, yeah, that's true. That's
you are
true.
punching above your weight.
I don't know. I'm going to have to examine that metaphor before embracing it. But you also have a Yale Law School degree, right?
I do, yeah. I'm an ex-lawyer and a MFA in writing as well, just for the hell of it.
And in fact, you write about legal affairs for the Daily Beast.
I do. I was writing about the Supreme Court this morning and meditation this afternoon.
Wow. Switch hitter. And you, for a while, were it says on your bio page, a professional LGBT activist, not an amateur.
That's right. Now I'm back to being an amateur, but that just means that was my day job for almost 10 years. Yeah.
Okay. So you get more done than I do, I think. And you've also gotten more deeply into meditation than I ever did. You've done like a 3-month meditation retreat, silent meditation retreat. Is that true?
Did a 2 and a 3-monther back to back. So it was my Dharma year was 2008, 2009. And, but it wasn't out of, diligence, or it was just what I most wanted to do in the world. I had actually, a relationship had ended, in 2007. And so I just asked, I was suddenly very free, more than I expected to be. And that's what I wanted to do.
Wow. So this book is interesting. It's as if one had kept a diary for a long, long time, chronicling one's progress along a spiritual path, and then gone back and selected the highlights so that, there's a fairly concise summary of the whole thing, right? Because these are pieces that were published along the way, I think almost entirely, right?
Yeah, I started the first ever Jewish online magazine, actually, in 2002. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these, what it grew into was just an opportunity we just wanted to publish stuff that wasn't being published anywhere else. And that included what I hoped was, if not philosophically rigorous, at least kind of rigorous in some sense, writing about spiritual practice. And so some of that was by me, some by other people. And then for this book, I revisited those pieces, re-edited them, kind of reordered them into something that felt like a logical order. And I did that because there were kind of two reasons. I mean, first, this was the book I would have really wanted to read when I was kind of starting out on a serious path of meditation. A lot of these books kind of have answers, but I was much more at the time, and even now, but really interested in people still asking questions that it seemed like the teachers with the answers had already answered. And then second, I always felt that this was my best writing on spirituality. And having written some of the books that you kindly mentioned at the top, it felt strange. It felt like my best stuff wasn't, was not what people knew. So it was really a joy to revisit some of this writing.
I know that feeling, actually, and it's kind of a sad one when you go back and read early stuff and you go, I think I was better then. It's like,
yeah,
that would make me over the hill now, wouldn't it?
Well, there's a freshness in there, right? I'm sure for you as well, that, there are questions that we kind of answer for ourselves, but until we do, those questions are really fresh and alive. And I think the book is joyful in a lot of ways, but there's also kind of a lot of loneliness in the book, stuff I don't feel as much now, married with a child, and just, I was at a different time in my life. And I think that kind of perspective or consciousness is actually really valuable. And I'm really thrilled that it sort of was preserved in the internet, and then could be repackaged in this way. Okay.
The book has 3 parts. There are 3 sections. You divide your journey into 3 sections. One thing you say near the beginning is, I feel relatively settled on how I relate to these still fundamental questions of love, God, and the contemplative path. But let's save that for the end of the conversation. I don't want to spoil the plot now and find out, exactly what you wound up learning. Let's start back at the beginning. You say you were not among those, and there are many, many people like this, who were driven to meditation to relieve suffering. Right.
Not on a conscious level, at least, I think. And it's funny, one of the things I do now is I work for a meditation app called 10% Happier.
Right.
And
Dan Harris's
thing. Dan Harris's thing. And the overwhelming majority of people who we come in contact with are, coming for reasons of dukkha, of suffering. Just, whether it's stress or anxiety or grief, loss, any of the modern forms of dukkha. There's ambient anxiety among everyone these days. And that may have been true for me on subconscious level, but consciously I went in for very unusual reasons, which was really mysticism. I had studied mysticism of various forms in college and in graduate school in my 20s, but always felt like it was kind of not for me. I mean, that was just something I studied. And at a certain point, due to changes in my life, I really felt like, well, I want to try to have some of these experiences, and meditation is a way that people do that, and it's one of the main ways people do that. And so that's what I did. I went very naively on my first 7-day silent meditation retreat, thinking I'd have amazing experiences of the divine or something, not knowing that first I'd have to sit through 5 days of looking at my own neurosis and self-defeating behavior.
Do you have a definition of mysticism?
Yeah, my working definition is just the direct experience of ultimate reality, whatever that means. So for many people, that's theistic. It could be a merging with the divine. For some, it's non-theistic, but that's.
But it's not conceptual; it's experiential.
Right. That's what I think one of the things that differentiates it, let's say, from religion or something, which is describing ultimate reality. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So you say you were. I don't know if you put it this way just now, but I got sense in your book that you were actually looking for the truth. You weren't, you didn't like just want to relieve some big anxiety problem. You were looking for the truth. And it occurred to me, I wondered but if you're so looking for the truth so intensely that you wind up doing things like 3-month meditation retreats, mustn't the lack of truth felt pretty damn uncomfortable? You know what I mean? I mean, there's such a thing. I guess I'm saying the line between motivation via suffering and motivation, via search for truth is not maybe as clear cut as. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that gets discovered in the book, even in the very first chapter or essay, which is called Loneliness and Faith. And that wasn't the first thing I had necessarily had written, but I put that first precisely to foreground that point, that while on a conscious level, my motivations may have been sublime experiences or something like that, yeah, there was suffering underneath that. And I don't think anyone really gets into the spiritual path without some impetus of suffering, whatever that is, whether it's loss or a lot of it in my case was being in the closet, a closeted gay man for my 20s, and being not accepting of myself, and to put it mildly, and the loneliness that comes with that. But I think very quickly, there's a quote that I actually just put up on my Instagram that I forget the author. Helen Schuchman is the author, and she said, "The task is not to find love, but to look inside at the obstacles that we place in love's way." I missed the exact words, but that's the idea that, there's something that's blocking us all the time, all of us as human beings. It's not just one or two people, but all however many billion of us. And so very quickly, the search for whether it's love or God or experience or truth turns inward at what it is that blocks us from that.
So where'd you do that 7-day retreat? That was your first big thing.
I did. My first retreat was called a Jewish meditation retreat, but it was really Vipassana, Buddhist style meditation in a Jewish container. I now actually teach that retreat. The same retreat is still going on.
Where is it? Where's the place?
It's now held in Falls Village, Connecticut, which is near Great Barrington in the Berkshires, at a Jewish retreat center. Since it is a sort of Jewish retreat, we do it the week of Christmas, which is a very convenient time to run a Jewish retreat. Yeah. And we do serve Chinese food on the 24th,
as is customary,
as we must. Yeah, and this was that was the summer of 2002 for me. Was that first retreat, and it really was life changing. It was. It took me a long time to untangle the different threads. The way in which Judaism and the Dharma were woven together weren't quite clear to me at the time. Now I feel very clear about it. Also the ways in which what we've just been talking about, looking at suffering and looking at profound transformative experience, those were also interwoven in ways that took me a while to kind of untangle for myself. And that's not to criticize the teachers. I mean, it's my journey. It was my own set of confusions. Went on that first retreat, not even really understanding what a silent retreat was. I thought that we were going to do a lot of silent meditation retreat. I didn't know we actually weren't going to talk.
Oh yeah, that is, I'm afraid, what silent means. So you said Vipassana. We should, for people who aren't conversant in this stuff, that's kind of, they can kind of think, loosely speaking, of mindfulness when they hear the word Vipassana. It literally means something more like insight. So you said for 5 days were hell, but then did amazing things happen? Or
they did, I don't mind talking about it. I think amazing things did happen. I did have to kind of go through. It was a pretty rough few days, and that process has repeated. It's not like however many 20 or 30 retreats that I've done since then. Now I just enter on day 5. You always enter with what you're bringing with you. And, a lot of this kind of meditation is just about seeing clearly whatever's up, whatever's happening. And that's usually not just sweetness and light, because I forget, but there was some Indian prince who said that suffering is kind of woven into the nature of life, and so I've heard of him. The name
escapes me.
Right, there's a statue of him just over my shoulder here. So that's what we come with every time. But it was true, I think when I look back now with 15 or 18 years of practice experience, a lot of it is just about preparing the mind. The mind gets concentrated and gets more quiet, and then the everyday beauty of life appears, and it appears quite luminous. At the time, those experiences really knocked my socks off. It felt like the fulfillment of a wish I didn't know I had for 10 or 15 years. And it seemed to conform so much to what I had read. Remember, other than a little bit of psychedelics in my 20s, I hadn't had these experiences, but I had read a lot about them. And so I was kind of a book mystic before I was an actual mystic, an armchair mystic. And so it felt like I had received the answer key to religion. Like, well, of course, this is what the whole, holiness is, and this is what the sacred is, and since then I've noticed that I have some experiences that other people have, and they don't have that interpretation of it. It could just be joy or equanimity or contentment or something like that. But the way I'm wired, I just seem to, it's not even a layering on top. It doesn't feel like an interpretation. The quality of the experience has to do with the numinous and the sacred. But I have noticed that not everyone feels that way.
Well, do you think that has to do with your having had an upbringing that was in some sense religious?
I think so. I think it's really just me being a weirdo. And I'm not the only weirdo. There's, millions of us around the world. I think some people are just some of us are sort of wired that way. There are plenty of folks raised in religious traditions who don't have any appetite for the sacred. And then there are plenty of people who are raised without a religious background, but who do have that. I think this is a line in the book that some people like golf and I like mysticism. And that actually, that line
some people like both.
Right, exactly. Doesn't have to be either or. It's good to get out of dualistic thinking. That actually, that line was kind of an important one for me because a lot of times, and I wonder if you've encountered this in the contemplative world, there's a little bit of a grasping on to like this activity is somehow more beneficial than everything else. Like this is the best thing that we can be doing with our time is spiritual practice in whatever tradition. And I do think it's better than others. I mean, I have nothing against golf, but certainly, the meditation over a period of years has a way of changing the mind in a way that most leisure activities don't. But it's usually richer than that. I found this almost spiritual elitism among a lot of folks, like, oh, and then there's competition for whose method is better. But even without that, I found it really helpful to just cop to this being what I want to do. And it just feels essential to me. It feels like one of the things that makes life worth living. And I'm an enthusiast. I don't know if you're an Enneagram person. I'm an Enneagram 7, which means I want to do everything and have every possible experience. So the idea that here is one of these potentially most powerful, transformative ways of being in the world, like I definitely want to try some of that.
Okay, so maybe you should put a finer point on the difference between the way you feel about this and look at it and name it and the way other people do. So you said some people might just say, it gave me great equanimity, it gave me joy, I saw more beauty, things like that. I mean, was the deal with you that you felt like this is the truth? Is that?
Yeah, but theistically as well early on when I was still more in the Jewish frame. I mean, this felt divine, or if not divine, at least holy or sacred. But I felt that way as a kid. I remember being 12, 13, 14 years old and walking around at summer camp, leaving all the kids and going off and walking in the woods and feeling a sense of sort of Wordsworthy and sublimity. I did not have the language of Wordsworthy and sublimity at the time when I was 12, but there was a sense of connectedness with nature. There was a sense of it was beauty, but beauty in a sort of religious sense of beauty. And so even before I had language for that or any particular it just seems to be how I process stuff. And that's true now too. I mean, I mentioned psychedelics once before. I'm still working with a couple of medicines, and often I'll have experiences which are to me obviously mystical union with the divine, and someone else will have the same experience with the same medicine and just say, well, that was really beautiful and great.
When you use the word medicine, you're talking about psychedelics or? Yeah. Okay.
But we use it. It's not, I think the word drugs has a lot of connotation, and it's right. Nowadays I don't party with those substances anymore because we all grow older. But so it's more in a spiritual container, whether in a shamanic kind of context or some other therapeutic context or something like that.
Now this is a kind of this is maybe a departure from a strictly chronological journey through your.
I knew we weren't going to be able to. I knew we couldn't keep
but
to it.
You did. There's an interesting thing about ayahuasca in your book. I forget which section it's in, but I wasn't aware, having not done ayahuasca or DMT, which is kind of a derivative of it, I guess. There's close chemical relative. I wasn't aware that whereas the regular psychedelics tend, although everyone's experience is different with these things, but tend to be unitive. In other words, they're conducive to the idea that, all is one, or these two different things I'm thinking about are actually one. Steve Jobs' big motivating epiphany was like technology and the liberal arts. They belong together. They are, I will unite them. I still don't know what the hell he was talking about. He just wound up making a computer and his phone and making a ton of money. But it worked for him as a motivation. In any event, there is a unitive tendency. And of course, a lot of people think of the classic mystical experience as being a unitive one, as you note, and, non-dual, the bounds of the self dissolve. I am part of everything. Everything is part of me, and so on. But what I didn't realize is you note that ayahuasca is very different and DMT is very, very different. You want to?
Yeah, I sure. I mean, it's funny. I threw that one in there, that particular essay, in at the end because there wasn't any other writing of mine on that subject that was on psychedelics or on medicine work. Yeah, I mean, what that essay engages with just what you mentioned, that when we look as a scholar at the history of mysticisms, inevitably there's going to be some kind of either confirmation bias or just we're looking for certain patterns. And that's one reason that the comparative enterprise is so fraught. If you're looking for two traditions that both use the color blue, you'll find that, but you might not notice that one other tradition uses the color green and yellow much more. But because you're looking for blue, you find blue, and now you write a book about how blue is the perennial philosophy and is the sacred color in every tradition. Which, by the way, it is the sacred color in Kabbalah, but not in every tradition.
I want to get to Kabbalah.
So likewise here, I think a lot of the writers on mysticism, certainly in the 60s and 70s, were influenced by psychedelics and by either their own experiences or others. And so there was a privileging of certain kinds of otherworldly or non-typical experience. But if you look in the history, so again, Jewish mysticism is what I know best. There are whole schools of Jewish mysticism that are non-unitive. So actually some of the earliest ones from the 2nd to 8th century of the Common Era, visions of divine chariots and angels. You see a lot of that on ayahuasca, DMT, and the tryptamines, these other class of molecules. Some people have unitive experiences. The experience of 5-MeO DMT, which is the toad medicine.
Right, that's DMT, apparently guaranteed to bring ego dissolution, right?
In my experience, I can guarantee that. Yeah.
That's amazing. I've heard that it's almost guaranteed to bring ego death.
Well, unless you fight it, in which case it's going to bring you to a hell realm for your 20-minute experience.
So would you say the people who say they've had negative experiences, and there are a few, in fact, I talked to Michael Pollan on this show about his book, How to Change Your Mind, and I think he had a negative, as I recall, he had a negative experience, but there was ego death, if I'm remembering correctly. But yeah,
I mean, even just the phrase ego death, if I went in with that phrase, that might conjure up a lot of fear, which is kind of a negative phrase. Yeah, yes. I mean, how about melting into the great lattice of being? I'll have some of that.
Yeah, it's harder to remember, though.
Yeah, I guess that's true. It's not as catchy. No, I've been in those ceremonies many times, and occasionally people really try to hold on. And I don't remember which psychedelic pioneer, might have been Terence McKenna, said the only bad trip is fighting the trip you're on. And that, I think that's right. I mean, you have to, unlike spiritual practice like meditation and so forth, in most cases, you really can't stop the process of how, you really do just dive into the deep end with these medicines, and you can't try to get out of the water. I don't know, I'm thinking of the wrong metaphor here, but like you can't. You have to, you actually you can't even swim. You just have to sink and allow that to happen. And I've had experiences where I didn't let that happen, and they were pretty negative experiences. A lot of people also don't remember the peak, particularly of the 5-MeO experience, because there is kind of no ego there at that moment, and so you're not really there. So it's hard to, it takes some practice to kind of.
So you mean they literally don't recollect that part?
Yeah, and
because there's no them to recollect.
If it's done in circle, there's 12 of us or something sitting around a circle. Like, they've clearly had some dissociative experience, but then they kind of snap out of it, and it's as if it didn't happen.
Well, then how do you ever know you've had it?
Sometimes you do remember.
Sometimes you do. It's just ironic when you
just
do.
Kind of going in, or you remember just coming out, or I several times I would have the intention after my first few ceremonies, having the intention to try to like remember and recollect, so that in daily life, I mean, I think one of the uses of this kind of medicine is to the negative, the drug term is flashback, like to have an unwanted flashback, let's say to an LSD trip. But a positive way of thinking about that is like recollecting that way of being, that unitive moment. And so that became a practice of mine. This is more recent. It's not in the book, of just trying to, like the Dzogchen Buddhist teachers say, small moments many times. So there's the small moment many time of settling back into what the Dzogchen people call primordial awareness, or Rigpa. There's also could be a small moment of settling back to the sense of unity that was glimpsed in a medicine ceremony. And I found both of those to be very, very helpful, both in the midst of difficult situations, but also for the positive. Just, I could be sitting on my sofa and decide to, let's taste into what the mind, it's almost like the mind remembers almost like a posture that it had, or how it was disposed in a particular moment. That's also and that can be incredibly powerful. That's also, last thing on this, unless you have more questions, that's also my practice around the jhanas, the Buddhist absorptive states, which now
jhanas are these levels of, is degrees of bliss is overly simple way of putting it. I mean, the higher level jhanas are pretty damn nice, apparently.
They're pretty awesome. Yeah, they're pretty great. It's interesting. The bliss kind of drops out. There's 4 main ones and then 4 additional ones, so 8 total. The bliss kind of drops out after number 3, and then it's just this really crystalline equanimity.
So is this? I mean, this is interesting to me. So I assume this is something that in your kind of 3-month, 5-month, during that part of your journey, you were getting into these jhanas, it's interesting. I mean, the idea that there really are these distinct levels, and you can say how you felt, and somebody can say, "Oh, that's number 3." It sounds a little suspicious, right? I mean, it just sounds a little too formal to actually apply to be able to encompass a lot of different human beings, right? But are you a believer, so to speak, in these kind of clear gradations of jhana-ness?
Well, let's see. I guess let me reframe that question, because I think I still hold it as a question. I don't have an answer, but I would reframe. I've definitely had exactly that experience. I've had the jhanic experiences that are as classically described in texts from 2,500 years ago. So the only question, or the question for me is it a self-fulfilling prophecy or not? So if you're working with a teacher who says, focus on that bliss that's coming up, then you're going to do that. And then lo and behold, you enter a bliss state. For me, I think it's probably some of each. I think it does seem like these are kind of ways the mind there's just like places the mind settle into. But you can think about it in a mundane way. I mean, if we let's go back to golf. So do you actually play golf?
Kind of.
So badly maybe, or I don't.
Yeah, increasingly, because I play more and more rarely, and at the same time, I'm getting older. Yes.
So there's certain feelings that you have as you play golf or tennis or whatever, and so it might be. You get in the zone. People have that experience. Is the zone the same for the flow state? Is the flow state exactly the same for everyone? Probably not, but it's similar enough that people can write books about the flow state. Or you could just have a pleasant contentment that arises as you're walking along and, shooting 18 over par or whatever. And it could
be a good day. That would be a good day for me.
It could be the pleasure of company, or the pleasure of a good day, or solitude for that matter. And these are things which other people also feel, and you could read nice essays or write nice essays about them. So I don't think these are different. I think these are just common experiences that if you go along and do a certain practice, whether it's golf or jhana meditation, you're going to have these experiences.
Can I interrupt? Can you tell me, is this at all jhana? Like on one meditation retreat, I don't generally go like looking for bliss on meditation retreats, but there was one where somebody had told me that sometimes by manipulating your eyes, you could do something. I did get to a point, like probably day 5 or day 6, where I forget if it was like moving my eyes up. I mean, my eyes were closed, but moving my eyes up or something would like let in more bliss. And it was, but the interesting to me was it would get to a point where I would go like, whoa, that's enough. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're not a good candidate for heavy psychedelic use.
Oh, is that right?
Because you want to, in jhana or in any of that, in concentration practice, which is what you're doing there, or cultivating states, when the mind says enough, you can say, okay, enough, and just settle back. That's the advantage, one of the many advantages of working without medicine, is that there's that ability to kind of regulate, the intensity of the state.
So you're saying that's not available to you if you...
if you if you took a decent dose of 5-MeO-DMT, you would not be able to say that's enough.
Yeah.
And in fact, saying that's enough might bring up resistance and could kind of suck for a little while.
Okay. So sorry, I interrupted you.
No,
go
I
ahead.
think that's fine. Yeah, I think, one teacher inside in a tiny, tiny universe of people who care about this particular kind of meditation, jhana meditation, there's a raging debate as to how intense the state has to be in order for it to count. Mm-hmm. So if you have any thoughts of the ego or the self, does that mean you're not yet it's not yet in, or could it be a little bit? And my view and the view of my teacher, Lee Brasington, is that this is from Ajahn Chah, who's a Thai Buddhist master. Mm-hmm. He said that the jhanas are like 4 pools in the forest, and the pools can be shallow or deep, but they're the same 4 pools. So, there's these 4 locations where the pools are, and the 4 jhanas, 4 lower jhanas. And that seems right to me. So they could be more or less intense. And what you experienced on your retreat could be as just less intense version of the first jhana. And we could spend the rest of the time just talking about that, because there's ways to kind of diagnose, here's what's happening, and I see this is arising, and this mental faculty is arising. And that can be really helpful. The point of these states is not to just get high. There are really, I think, maybe 3 main points, just really briefly. One is it's hard to get into them, so you'd have to do a lot of what the Buddhists call purification of mind. So the process to get in is very helpful. The second, they're so blissful and empowering that they can really power your practice. They're like really, really good rests, and you come out with enthusiasm and bliss, and it makes sitting 8 hours a day in meditation much more bearable. Which is why I think the Buddha recommended it. And third, finally, when you come out of these states right as you're coming out, so you're really just the process of insight meditation, of noticing things non-judgmentally and noticing impermanence and noticing other things like that, just is so easy. The metaphor I've used for people is it's like bicycling downhill instead of uphill. You just coast on down, and the mind is so clear and quiet and sharp. And that you can really measure. I don't know if that counts as objective, but you can certainly, in your own experience, see, that the mind just notices things much more effectively because it's been so quieted and so settled in jhana. So that's why those 3 reasons are sort of, for me, the main benefits of this kind of practice. And I'm not ashamed of number 2, which is that the states are so sublime that they really do have an impact. That's not the point. It's not meant to be the dead end, but it's part of what powers practice along.
Okay. Now, does this belong in phase 1 of your journey, your experimentation with jhanas?
I would say phase 3, if I had to pick a phase.
Okay. So
I think phase 1 was having these states a little more like what you just described, having these states arise and not really having a language or a system to understand what's happening. There's a second or third piece in the book is sort of actually has a little bit, you mentioned at the beginning, it's like having a diary, actually has a tiny bit of diary entries while I was on retreat and not supposed to be writing. And you can, at least when I look at that writing, you can see the altered state in the writing. And it's a beautiful altered state. It's not like a hallucination.
How is the writing different?
There's a certain softness that's in there that is just, the faculties of doubt, which is what that essay is really about, is how doubt kind of comes back in. At some of that peak stage, there's sort of a certainty that the doubt is wrong. That no, this is definitely not a hallucination. This is the mind, on acting really well. So this is not the mind impaired or deluded, but this is the mind refined. And that certainty disappears. That sense of certainty passes. And so it's a certainty, but it's a very soft certainty. I'm not sure if that sounds almost like a contradiction. Certainty is usually very firm, but I guess the word would be confidence. There's like a real confidence in that peak, in writing in the peak experience. But even at that time, I didn't have the answer. I didn't have a system. I didn't have a way of comprehending or understanding what was happening. That's what makes, I think, that essay, that particular one, maybe of interest or of value to some people, that here's a mind trying to figure out what's going on. That here's this powerful altered state that seems much more clear than regular consciousness, that's much more filled with love and compassion than ordinary consciousness. And what's going on?
No, it is an amazing feeling. I mean, you remember at the end of my first retreat that, everything is more beautiful than usual. You're less judgmental toward people and more inclined to see the beauty in them. And there's a conviction that this is a truer view of the world. And it's a conviction I'm willing to defend. I mean, in an argumentative way. I mean, I think there are reasons, and I've done that. I think there are reasons to believe it's a clearer view of the world. And that's the amazing thing is the promise, it's an amazing thing about the claim of Buddhism is that the reason you're suffering and making other people suffer is because you're not seeing the world clearly. It's great to be able to solve all these problems at once.
Well, I know we're ostensibly talking about my book, but that is one of the things I loved about the framing of why Buddhism is true. First of all, from the title on down, and I know you and I talked about the title and questions about the title, but yeah. I love the combination of argumentativeness and compassion. Like you're sort of a fiercely argumentative advocate for more wisdom, compassion, and love. And I love that combination because that's a space that I inhabit all the time. And it has been fun. Your books come up in conversations with others. And I'll be like, oh yeah, he did this. First he did this thing on God. And now he wrote this book on, why Buddhism is true. It's like, why Buddhism is true. And it sort of offends people. And I think that's a really productive offense. Like it then leads to a really good kind of conversation, because I think what you just said a second ago is one of the kind of arguments of the book. It's like, yeah, here's a way to see more clearly. Is it true that this is seeing more clearly, or is it actually delusion? Well, here's some reasons why it actually does look like that's seeing more clearly. Like it's more true.
This is my belief. So let's get a little more into the background you entered all of this with. At one point in the book, you say that one thing that happens in the course of your journey is that in some sense you lose your religion.
Yep.
So describe the religion you lost.
This is not what I was raised with, but when I was about 20, I fell in love with the Jewish path of observance. The Hebrew word is halakha, which literally means like the way to go. It's very similar to the word the Dharma, that this is the path. And that path involves ritual observance, ethical observance. It's a lot of law.
So you were not brought up observant?
I was brought up middle of the road conservative. So we were sort of observant, but not the way I was in my 20s.
So how, in what ways, what's the difference? What were you doing in your 20s that you hadn't been doing?
Let's see. In my teens, we would go to a normal restaurant and eat spaghetti, but not eat the meatballs. And then in my 20s, I'd go to a normal restaurant and I wouldn't eat the spaghetti. I'd only have a salad.
Okay.
That's a very Jewish answer to that question.
That really is. It's not a Christian answer. I know that.
No, it's really not. It's a legalistic, and that's if there's a beauty to the path, that is the beauty of the path.
Speaking of Jewish answers, there's two things that a few people have said to me, and they were all Jewish. One of them is like, Bob, you don't understand. Religion's not about belief. Okay. I'm like, speak for yourself. I mean, everyone where I come from, religion is totally about belief. The other thing is, a couple of people have said, when I've said, are you spiritual but not religious? They said, no, I'm religious but not spiritual.
Both very, very Jewish things. So one of the rabbis who first had an impact on me, Rabbi Michael Paley, who said, to be a good Jew, you have to believe in one God or fewer. And I think that's definitely right. There's that old saw that Judaism is a religion of deed, not creed. Mm-hmm. And it's not 100% true, but there's a lot of truth to that. There really is. And certainly when I was living that lifestyle in the first half of my 20s, let's say to age 22 to 26, 27, I would definitely have said I was religious but not spiritual. And there's a whole philosophy of that, of how the sort of translation of spirituality into daily life is through legalistic religious observance. So there's a famous passage that I discuss in the book. There's one of the books that the sort of the best representation of this worldview is called Halachic Man by Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And he was very much invested in that view, that worldview, as opposed to a more traditional spirituality, which was you should sense the beauty in everything. And there's a passage in the book that I quote where he talks about the sunset. And the sort of general spiritual, or you could say romantic vision of the sunset is the beautiful colors, and you're moved to reflect on the grandeur of God, if that's part of your worldview, or just at the beauty of nature. And for halachic man, the person who follows this path, actually what's beautiful about the sunset is now I have different obligations. Now it's time for the evening prayer, not the afternoon prayer. If it's a holiday, now the holiday has begun. And I came to totally reject that view, but that was my sort of guiding way of thinking for almost 10 years. And so when you ask what's the religion I lost that. And the cover of the book has a loaf of challah on it, the Jewish bread for Sabbath. And that's actually derived from an essay in the book called Fresh Baked Bread, which is about the experience, as Stephen said, not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself. In a Jewish observance or legal observance, the significance of that bread is the blessing that you make over it, the fact that you're required to eat it at a certain time. It signifies the Shabbat. And I don't want to put this worldview down. It animates the lives of a couple of million people. And it meant a lot to me for a long time, but I really came to reject it and value the bread as the experience of fresh baked bread, and how you can be mindful in that experience, or you could have delight in that experience, and just the very simple experience of it. There was a writer whose name I'm forgetting, who said that Zen is the unsymbolization of the world. And that's a valuable line for me.
And so, and this happened through your meditative practice,
it really eroded. Another piece that's in the book was coming to get to a place where that sense of groundedness and connectedness that many people get through religion, I felt like I could just have generated without any of the myth or the observance or the creed or the faith, just in meditation. And that I felt like was even more important, because for me, it's that sense of groundedness and security that drives so many people to nationalism or to, let's say fundamentalist religion, conservative religion, that here's something that's true. Like, here's something that's certain. Here's my group is where I derive my meaning for, or my myths or my beliefs, my faith or my God. And it feels like that's kind of a dangerous idea right now, or an idea at least that causes a lot of suffering, let's say. And so for me, setting that aside was a huge piece. But I have to say, it's still, even today, if an observance I don't do, let's say the idea of food, because Jews talk about food all the time. If there's something not kosher food that's brought into the house, there is that intuitive, instinctual, like Mary Douglas purity and danger recoiling, like impure, not okay. And, I just sit with that for now. It takes about 3 seconds for that to subside. So it's not a long, but if I'm noticing, if I'm paying attention, that recoiling, which is totally irrational, also can be really harmful to self and others. It's still in there. And that's really interesting, I guess, to see that that's still there. So I've kind of deliberately worked on just sitting with that and not listening to that voice that recoils, because that's the same voice that recoils against gay people, or against Muslims, or against anything that's perceived as other. And it may not, to use food examples is to trivialize it, right? Because it's kind of ridiculous to feel that way about a cheeseburger. But I can guarantee you that I have felt that way about a cheeseburger. And it's fascinating to see this reptilian brain be captured by religious dogma, even years after setting aside that dogma.
So when you lost your religion, though, you did not lose belief in God, which is what most Christians would mean by losing their religion.
Well, I gained a lot more skepticism about what we say what we're really saying when we say believe in God or experience of God. So even that, as you know from my other work from non-dual Judaism, I would definitely say 75% of Christians would say I'm an atheist if it's God does not exist, but God is existence itself. So my theology is already wouldn't pass muster, I guess, among some.
So you're kind of a pantheist?
Yeah, ish. But now it's even the Buddhism has really scoured even that. It's kind of, there are definitely experiences of the sacred. There's non-rational experiences that involve a sense of personhood to the cosmos that I can't really explain. And so I'm just in a sort of agnostic, I don't know, place around those experiences, despite having had pretty intense experiences, as we talked about before. So I would actually say that even, I don't know, or there's an early essay in the book titled "Am I Religious?" ? Even now, I don't know if it depends who's asking. Do I believe in God? I mean, it depends what we mean by believe and God. Probably what we mean by the word "in" also, although I'm not sure about that one. Do I have a belief in an anthropomorphic creator deity who, founded the earth in 7 days? I don't have that belief. Or even a sort of more liberal version of that where, there's sort of the force for God as the force for good in the world. I guess I don't really know about that. I guess I definitely have a experience of the sacred. And so whether that's connected to a God figure or not feels kind of secondary. But it does differentiate me from being a pure Western Buddhist. Most Buddhists of Asian descent had devotional elements and religious elements and supernatural elements in their practice.
And
it's only
plenty of gods. Yeah.
Yeah. It's only this very weird little Western offshoot that sort of is really as non-theistic as some people like to say. Yeah. And I'm not in that kind of secular space, secularism. There's still a love of the sacred. And that's definitely still true for me today, even though I don't have any theology or myth to explain it.
Okay. So talk about some of your, some deep meditative experiences you've had that went beyond bliss or weren't just about bliss, but had to do, I don't know, were more metaphysical or non-dual or something.
Well, one way that the Theravadan Buddhist tradition that I have practiced in defines enlightenment is the intuitive knowing of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths, really quickly, that there is suffering. That suffering is caused by clinging on to stuff. Like we really want the good stuff and really don't want the bad stuff. That it is possible to interrupt that. It is possible to cling less, and here's a way to do it. That's the fourth noble truth. Here's the way to do that. For me, the key there is intuitive. It's not just an intellectual knowledge, and that's where the work comes in. So that's where seeing over and over and over and over again the way that we cling from moment to moment, clinging to the next breath, clinging to sense desire, wanting more food. I'm back on the food, or whatever it is, sex, fame, success, recognition, love, power, money, whatever. And just seeing that moment to moment again and again and again and again. And on one of my longer retreats, I really had the sense that I was just babysitting my mind while it figured this out. Like there wasn't anything my rational brain had left to do. Like I get it. I get it. Yeah. I get impermanence. I even get non-self, but I certainly get the dukkha part, the suffering part. I get it. But what does that mean? Get it. So I think for me, some of the more transformative experiences have been from getting it intuitively, where the brain, maybe we don't really know that yet, but certainly the mind kind of readjusts or recalibrates. It just learns the hard way, because there's no other way so far to do it, that enduring happiness, like real happiness, is not going to come from out here, from the stuff that I can either grab or push away, that it's impossible to arrange the conditions in the world for my happiness, that it comes from a kind of settling back from that and clinging less. And so that, in a way, maybe that sounds less profound than like the altered state stuff, but that's more profound, because when there's that intuitive knowledge, the mind has actually shifted.
Yeah, and one reason it's profound is because the idea is that not only can this liberate you from suffering in principle, it also cuts through all the stuff that is clouding your vision. But because, when you look at the things that, just look at like what's called the psychology of tribalism, and the way that blurs your view of the goodness of your group, your in group, and the badness of the out group. All of that, all of those distortions boil down to like wanting something, wanting to believe this, wanting to believe that. I really do believe it's all one piece. So it's not a trivial thing, and it's not just therapeutic.
No, I think that's right. And I don't want to downplay the therapeutic piece, especially, again, at 10% Happier. This is my choice to work with people who are really new to all this stuff. So we've been talking Dan Harris uses this phrase like the deep end of the pool and the shallow end of the pool. We've had a lovely deep end conversation, but also there's so much suffering at the shallow end of the pool. And I think it's remarkable that both on 5-month silent meditation retreats and in 15 minutes listening to an app on your iPhone, there is a similar benefit adheres, obviously different in degree, but not necessarily different in kind.
No, if you calm down a little, you can probably see things a little
bit better. And that's what I love. That's Dan's genius of that title, about 10% happier. Like, could you really get 100% happier? Let's not worry about that. Could you get 10% happier? Yeah. Is it worth a fair amount of effort to get that? Probably is. So I love, I think that was a stroke of genius that he titled his book that, and now the app is titled that. But that's why, when you asked, tell me about some of the best meditation experiences, it just sounds like 10% happier on squared, so 100% happier, because it's the mind learning intuitively. And, in the Theravadan tradition, there's all kinds of maps and charts about what happens when that happens, and nibbana and nirvana, all the rest. So, but that's as good as it gets.
Okay, so to get back to the deep end of the pool, if it's not only 100% happy but 100% clear in vision, that's when we sometimes start using words like enlightenment. And you talk in the book about what enlightenment means. There's an essay on like Jewish enlightenment. What is I have a pretty strict old school view of enlightenment, sufficiently strict that I suspect there aren't any enlightened people, or at least very few, but, I think, anyway, maybe I shouldn't be that judgmental and skeptical, but it's a pretty strict view. What is your, you fool around with different views of enlightenment, I guess it's fair to say, right?
Can I use that as the blurb for the book?
Yeah.
Jay fools around with different views of enlightenment.
Not
that's
since
accurate.
the Holy Bible has anybody fooled around with so many views of enlightenment.
Yeah, so first of all, just to be very clear to anyone who might get the wrong idea, I am definitely not enlightened. My partner is here in the apartment with me. He can verify that very clearly. So, I think there are different views, and I think the Dharmic view, well, even the Buddhist view, because that's different from the Hindu view. The Jewish view is a little more like the Hindu view, which is that enlightenment has something to do with going back and forth to states of union or sublimity. Judaism is a householder religion, so that very rarely, almost never, were there monastic traditions within Judaism, and so their ideal has to have, and there's that whole legal tradition. So the ideal has to have something with being in the world, being more just, but it's that oscillation of perspective, seeing the world from the relative perspective of that's our ordinary world, and from the absolute perspective where everything is God and everything is one, and there's it's just the world of non-self where there's not separate things. But it's not a notion of one and done. Like I had a big enough experience and so now I'm permanently enlightened. It's much, in the Jewish view at least, it's much more of a kind of back and forth. And that's true in the Theravadan Buddhist world and the Zen Buddhist world also, because it is very rare to really get, it's not one and done, it's like 4 and done or 7 and done. Like there's all these maps. How many transformative, earth-shadowing ego-death experiences do you have to have before you finally hit it? But I think in monastic traditions, they would all say that works if you're a monk or a nun. There's no way to you can't have a mortgage and not have suffering. So, or a family or a career, or any of the things which we householders take for granted, maybe in terms of what it is to live. So I think your high bar is probably warranted. I can recommend to you some self-declared arhants, fully enlightened Buddhist folks.
I've spoken to some of them, and maybe I should mention some of them now. Well, I guess Kenneth Falk I spoke to on this show, I think, and I think he calls himself enlightened, doesn't he, or does he? I think he does.
I think he's a little more tentative, but he would be one to talk to, yeah.
Because I think I remember him saying, he was saying, yeah, I lost my temper with my wife the other day. And I said, well, wait, then you're not enlightened, right? And I kind of meant it. It, right? I mean, that's how strict my definition is.
And that's borne out. Look, there's again, staying with Buddhism, the Visuddhimagga, which is the classical Buddhist commentary in this stream of Buddhism, is very clear. No, there should be no passions with the arhat. And if you've lost your temper, you're doing something wrong. That being said, in Vajrayana and Mahayana Buddhism, where there's a different kind of model of enlightenment, there is space for that. There is space for anger and for sadness. There's a famous Zen story about someone whose child dies and he cries, and the students ask why you're crying. This is in Gate of Tears, actually. And he says, I'm crying because I'm sad. The idea being, if you're fully enlightened, you're just present with what is, and you're sad. If an unspeakable tragedy happens, you feel sad. So they're different models. So I think your model is a little more Burmese and a little less Japanese. Yeah.
Now, there is a guy I think is very interesting. You know who Gary Weber is, probably. You may know him. He doesn't say he's enlightened, but he does describe himself kind of as if he were. I mean, he has all the hallmarks according to his own description of what his life is like, or has many of the hallmarks. And he came to mind when I was reading, I think it was your essay on Jewish enlightenment, and you were saying in the Jewish tradition, it is more like, you get back to life and you're not perfect. You got to deal with it. And I think at some point you say, well, you couldn't live life if you were always in a state of enlightenment, because it was almost as if you wouldn't be able to function. But a couple of things. I mean, Gary describes himself as in a certain sense functioning better since he lost the sense that he's actually in control of anything, and it all just happens. And there's actually a literature on this. I mean, somebody did a study recently that I wrote about in my newsletter, the Nonzero newsletter, which, by the way, people can subscribe to by going to nonzero.org. But it was a study where a number of people who, could plausibly claim to be enlightened, and people in their spiritual communities kind of attested to the plausibility, that said this same thing. They lost the sense that they were making decisions. They lost but a lot of them were in very demanding vocations, performing very well. So there are people who seem to stay in a state that's very different from mine. I mean, Gary professes to have very few self-regarding thoughts about himself. But they get by. I mean, very well,
Yeah, I think there's all kinds. First, I'd like to validate these self-described experiences of enlightenment. I think there's a tendency that a lot of us have to sort of put it as totally impossible. And, I don't think it's totally impossible. I take these folks at their word. Jeff Foster, who teaches the non-dual tradition, is another person, youngish person who comes to mind. I was hanging out with Byron Katie recently. And Katie's a little bit different because she and Eckhart Tolle is another one like Katie, who are a little bit like, they all have people around them,
Meaning?
So Katie has her husband who deals with a lot of the logistics, and she's really kind of in the zone a lot of the time. I don't know if it's all the time, but it's definitely a lot of the time in a way that would make, the sort of mundane stuff, catching flights and, making hotel reservations a little bit more difficult. And yet, certainly I get that sense from her of settledness and love and, truth and awareness, all of the hallmarks to me of an awakened being. So I tend to, I wouldn't say I take people at their word. That maybe is giving it too much credit, but I would say that having met several of these kind of very realized beings along the way, it does seem like something that happens, and it has not happened for me. Maybe a little bit of the way. I definitely, there's no question that I'm happy.
Yeah, I mean, I have a sense for it because I've been particularly, probably on retreat where things were flowing very readily. And I could see there was a correlation between, how easily things were coming and how easy functioning kind of was, and how clear I felt. And how little I was obsessed with myself and so on. I see the correlation. I just haven't spent very much time at the deep end of that pool of correlations.
Yeah, though, even then, I mean, you had that experience on retreat, and then you get to the salad bar and somebody took all of the olives. And
they have to be punished when that happens.
And now you're pissed, and I think, and then God forbid you get a phone message from home that you actually have to deal with something in the real world, and your yogi mind can barely handle it. So yes, those are beautiful, and I've had that experience many, many times, and they're lovely. But even that, those things pass. Those are conditioned. I think for me,
that's the problem.
What was appealing about this intuitive knowledge of the Four Noble Truths is the notion that the brain can actually change. We don't know if it's the hardware or the software, or if that's even the right metaphor, but something changes in the mind in a way that's lasting. And I've experienced a little bit of that, a portion of it. And so it seems, having experienced a little bit of it, it seems plausible that others would have experienced a lot of it.
And how close have you had to let's say I guess DMT kind of answers the question. I was going to say to not self-experience or pure non-dual experience, but those
are the dual ones. When you're visiting the machine elves and the cosmic matrix, it is actually still somewhat. It's relational. That's what's so interesting.
But I thought that one kind of DMT, MEO3 or 5-MeO, whatever, is kind of the exception to the DMT rule.
Yeah, it's a tryptamine that provides the unitive experience. That's true. Yeah.
Anyway, do you want to say anything about non-dual experiences you've had generally, especially on meditation retreats, I guess, or while meditating? Or,
I mean, I think so. I one thing that I talked about a lot back when I wrote Non-Dual Judaism, and it's a little bit in the book, also in the new book, Enlightenment by Trial and Error, also is that every experience in a way is a non-dual experience. So, I've had many unitive experiences where the boundaries of the self are lower. Mm-hmm. But is this Ram Dass or someone else who enlightenment isn't really about a special wave? It's the wetness of all waves. That that to me feels like, that feels right to me in a certain way, especially if there is a kind of panentheistic or non-dual view. That would mean that every moment is a moment that's susceptible to wonder or any other kind of consciousness, or right seeing or wrong seeing. So it strikes me as that being, so the unitive experiences do feel like they show the mind a different way of considering itself with different boundaries. That seems to be more accurate based on what we know from science about what consciousness is or isn't, about how separate the self is or isn't, what the self really is. Is there really a little homunculus inside of our brain that goes up to heaven when we die, or is it different? Is this kind of consciousness actually sort of an illusion that the ego that we're telling ourselves? So it seems to correlate with something that the rational mind also understands. And then do you come out more of a schmuck or less of a schmuck? That's been sort of the proof in the pudding for me, especially now. It's fun revisiting these early mystical experiences from 18 years ago. Now I'm changing diapers most days, so life has shifted and the arena of practice has shifted. And so what seems to stick is actually back to the mundane stuff, being at the deep end, and now coming back to the so-called shallow end, where it's just, is this comment something I say or don't say? Is this feeling something I can exist with or not exist with? And if I can't exist with this feeling, does that mean I push it out onto someone else? Basic Dharma 101. And that feels fine. I don't want to say that that's more valuable than the deep end of the pool, but it's certainly the part of the pool where I think
one connection is that kind of tools you learn to use like while on retreat. In daily life, the key becomes just remembering to use them, and you wouldn't be able to do, at least I wouldn't be able to do that if I hadn't spent time really focused on the practice in a deeper way than everyday life permits.
That sounds right to me. And I think the peak experiences part, one of the values of it is that it powers along your practice. It gives you the confidence to sit there and to do the work. And it's not gritting your teeth and sitting there, because you're sitting there, but also aware of all of this love that's flowing around. Sometimes it's bliss, sometimes it's love, sometimes it's just equanimity. Sometimes it's just really, equanimity is just really clear seeing. You just see something so clearly. There's a beauty that's beyond beauty in that. Like, it's just so beautiful to just see clearly and be on balance, not be shaking around and not be grabbing on. Anytime there's a bliss experience, there's likely to be like a little bit of grabbing on because it's a bliss experience. And when that goes away and it's just equanimity, there's something even more beautiful than bliss about that it's just quiet.
Yeah. I had this experience once. Oh, well, never mind. Let's get back to Jewish mysticism.
I'm sure the listeners and viewers want that sentence to be finished.
I doubt they would if they heard it. Well, of course, then they'd have heard it, and they
maybe heard it on previous episodes, but
they haven't. This is actually something I thought about putting in my book, but I didn't. But it's not like it's just not that interesting. Is why I didn't put it in the book. But Jewish mysticism, we alluded to this. One thing I didn't realize, it gets back to this question of whether a mystical experience has to be unitive or can be something else. I didn't realize that the guy who wrote what some would consider the classic text on Jewish mysticism is Sholem. Is it Gershom Sholem?
Gershom Sholem, yep.
Yeah. That he said that Jewish mysticism isn't unitive, right? There's apparently controversy about this, but that was his view.
Yeah, I think the controversy is resolved, that most of it's not and some of it is. Sholem seemed to be on a bit of a crusade to differentiate Jewish mysticism from others, and that seemed to be part of his commitment to kind of how he understood Judaism, as being much more of an internal system rather than one that it obviously was in dialogue with Sufism and mystical Christianity and other streams as well. There are unitive texts that are his kind of successor, I guess. Moshe Idel, a preeminent Kabbalah scholar and one of my teachers of today, has brought many texts that are completely unitive in phenomenology and the way they describe the experience. But it's also true that a lot are not. And I just remember in college, this sort of, it was more of a controversy, like, oh, is Jewish mysticism not as good as other mysticisms because it's not unitive? But then if you look, there's sort of, if you were to flatten the Christian mystical tradition to just say, well, the best experiences are the ones that are purely unitive, but if you're still having the Virgin Mary or somebody appear in a vision, that's not as good. That's not how the traditions understand themselves. And it also seems a little disrespectful, but it also doesn't seem accurate or honest as a scholar to have that kind of, really it's a theological agenda of ranking mysticism.
Yeah, and certainly a lot of the so-called Christian mystics, I don't mean so-called in a dismissive way, but I mean a lot of the people called Christian mystics do not sound mystical in a very Eastern sense.
Right. And I think now, again, we're many decades on from the sort of naive comparative project of the, let's say, 50s and 60s. I think now there's an understanding that mysticism takes a lot of different shapes and forms, and it just so happens that the psychedelics that were in use at the time and in the 60s do produce a certain kind of unitive experience, and so lots and lots and lots of people, including lots of scholars, had that experience. There's one book, I won't mention the name of the book or the author because I'm about to savage it, but it was this kind of tragic, this guy had a peak experience that was unitive in nature, and then he traipsed around meeting all of these very wise mystical teachers, spiritual teachers, contemplative teachers, basically asking to validate his experience. Like, is this experience in your tradition? And then if it wasn't, he would set that aside and keep looking for, the tradition that had the experience that he had. And
this is a classic research method that's been used in many disciplines.
Exactly. So I think, that's a real book, but that's also the kind of straw man. It's the actual straw man of what we don't want. What we want is a sort of robust appreciation of the similarities and differences.
And of course, then you can wind up arguing, if you want, about whether we even should be using one word to describe these things. Is there such diversity that we shouldn't? So
there's a scholar named Boas who has written an article called "There Is No Such Thing as Jewish Mysticism," making exactly that point. We're importing this term mysticism from other traditions. It doesn't apply to Kabbalah and to other mystical and esoteric writing, and we'd be better off without it. It's not my view, but it's an articulate view.
So speaking of Kabbalah, and I'm still a little unclear on the pronunciation for starters. I think you've pronounced it in two different ways in the course of this conversation, unless I'm mistaken.
I probably have. So this boils down here. We'll do it the real way. I'll explain. In Ashkenazic, so most American Jews are of Ashkenazic descent, Eastern European descent, and the pronunciations of Hebrew words became kind of Europeanized. So Kabbalah is the way you'd say it in Hebrew, but Kabbalah is how you would say it in Yiddish, and thus then in Ashkenazi influenced English. So that's also true. So in Hebrew, the Sabbath is the Shabbat. So Shabbat. But if you were in a Hasidic community, nobody says Shabbat. They say Shabbos, which notice it shifts the T sound to an S, and it shifts the syllable emphasis to the first syllable. And it sounds more like German. It sounds more like, the languages that Yiddish was influenced by, Shabbos. So good Shabbos instead of Shabbat Shalom, which is Hebrew, you'd say good Shabbos, which is a mixture of Yiddish and Hebrew. So there's the full explanation.
Now, as for Kabbalah itself, so help me understand this, because I've had the experience probably of some other people. If you hear that, okay, this is the Jewish version of mysticism, and you go in expecting to see something familiar, and pretty soon it's these people decoding the text, and it sounds like numerology, and they're saying like, well, this letter stands for this, and the secret message encoded in this text is this, right? And that doesn't remind me of Buddhism. So what is the deal here?
It's funny because actually there's a lot of Buddhist commentaries that do exactly that, right? So like a lot of Mahayana, because the Mahayana especially, like they have to understand these earlier texts which didn't have Mahayana ideas in them as having Mahayana ideas in them. So they actually do the same thing, and the Kabbalists did the same thing in the 13th century.
You mean it's literally a question of encryption as opposed to, say, an allegorical interpretation of early text? It's
all of the above. So there's the Mahayana Sutras, which are a whole new literature, right, that were discovered but were said to be from the original time. And then, interpretations of words or phrases or gestures, sometimes allegory, sometimes it's the New Testament reading the Old Testament. So all of those are present. When I tend to amass for a definition of Kabbalah, I'll call it the Jewish mystical and esoteric tradition, because a lot of, as you pointed out, a lot of what happens is textual interpretation. The best book for listeners on the distinctiveness of Kabbalistic mystical experience is a book by a scholar named Malila Hellner Eshed, and the title is A River Flows from Eden, and I think the subtitle is Mystical Experience in the Zohar. The Zohar is the masterpiece of Kabbalah. Because it's true, while you can find some traditional kind of mystical experiences in the Zohar, the overwhelming majority, 99%, is more like what you just described. Like, here's the symbolism of this verse of text, and here's this and here's that. And Malila shows, I think, really convincingly, it's a masterpiece. She really shows how that is the experience. It's sort of a textual mysticism. And I've had that experience. Now, wait,
when you say that is the experience, you mean?
So in the Zohar, there are a lot of is the experience that we're looking for in the Zohar when some of the rabbis say, his face was filled with light and everything was illuminated, like that looks like a traditional, some kind of supernatural experience. And sure, that's one. But also the experience is being in the flow, the symbolic flow, where it's almost like a jazz jam session. And, one figure will say this and one figure will say that. Probably, we don't know this for sure, but the Zohar, which is most of it is structured as a conversation among different Talmudic rabbis, certainly not from the Talmudic period. It may be recreating actual conversations that happened among the circle of mystics in Spain in the 13th century, and kind of, it may be that. And I've been a few times, not many times, in Zoharic circles like that, where that happens. And if you know enough of the material, the symbolic structure becomes primary in your mind, and the sort of surface level of reality becomes really secondary. So the associations of different aspects of the Sfirot, these emanations of the divine with different colors or different words or different moods or different symbols or literary figures, biblical figures and myth, that actually does you really do get in the flow. of that. And I've described it. That's a pretty unsophisticated description. Malila's book really discussed it much more in detail. So no, but that's right. If you just open a random, I could pick one off the shelf, a random book of Kabbalah, and look for 20th century and 21st century, you'll see more traditional mystical experience because it's delivering what the audience expects. Mm-hmm. But the medieval material doesn't conform to that. And then the earlier strata of Jewish mysticism, what are called Heichalot and Merkava. So Heichalot means palaces and Merkava means chariots, which are these, as I mentioned, it seems a while ago, 2nd to 8th century or 9th century texts about visions of the heavens. Mm-hmm.
Like some of the Christian mystics.
Exactly. And same place, same time. So it's not a unitive experience. It's an ascent of the soul that then goes and visits heaven or the heavenly realms. Even that's mediated a lot by language, interestingly, in the Jewish tradition. And that's, circling back to my little book, it was just shocking. I hadn't expected to ever in my life have an experience that seemed like that. Because I don't have that theology or cosmology that there's mm-hmm. a place called heaven and that there are angels and stuff, but I have seen it. So I don't have, it's not in my worldview, but I have been there. But it is true that if it's tricky because now I think if you just Google Kabbalah, I assume the first thing anyone would find would be the Kabbalah Center, which is a recent phenomenon that kind of mixes New Age stuff, new thought, the idea that you can create your own reality.
That's Madonna's thing?
Her former thing, but yeah, her thing.
Oh, she's no longer into that?
As far as I know. And, there's a lot of money floating around and it's a funny thing. It felt like Kabbalah was becoming a little more mainstream about 20 years ago. And then came the Kabbalah Center, and now it's hidden once again. It's just hidden behind something claiming to be Kabbalah that's actually very different. So the esoteric tradition remains esoteric.
So at the beginning of this, I quoted this line where you said, "I feel relatively settled on how I relate to these still fundamental questions of love, God, and the contemplative path." I said we'd hold off until the end, to wait for you to tell us what you meant by that. I think you've told us a certain amount of what you meant by that in the course of the conversation. But before we go, what else would you like to say about kind of where you've wound up? And also feel free to revisit any highlights along the way that you wish I had asked you about.
Yeah, I think, especially in part 2 of the book, there's a lot of angst and wrestling with the losing my religion part. I feel very little to none of that now. The Jewish religious practices that I still do, I actually really like. They're mostly family practices, lighting candles with my daughter and, celebrating Shabbat in a nice way, a form of keeping kosher still. But, it's really, I was, in addition to being a professional LGBT activist for 10 years, I was also a professional Jew for a number of years in my career.
What's the 9 to 5 of that like?
I got to tell you, it's a lot better being a professional Buddhist, which is what I am now. Much, 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 much better. It's only a supporting theme in the book, but in my life, the sort of tightness around Israel-Palestine and around Jewish politics and stuff was so intense during those periods, and it's still very intense. I'm just not really part of it. So it has sort of settled into, I love the Jewish teaching that I occasionally do. The sort of, I call it like the boutique Judaisms that I'm part of, whether it's Jewish meditation or the social justice Jewish community, which is lovely. For a long time, my sense of what really is valuable from a contemplative perspective has been dharmic more than being Jewish. So the Jewish parts are these sort of devotional, folkloric, communal, linguistic, symbolic, culinary aspects. It feels like the real question animating our moment is how do we get people to be a little less brutal? I think it's so funny, you and I think we had our last talk 3 years ago, right after the Trump election.
Yeah, you thought I was a little hard on you, as I recall.
I've forgotten that. So,
no. What it was, I was kind of, you had written I would say a bit angrily about Trump, and what I was challenging you
well,
on
who got
was
the better
like
of that conversation 3 years on.
well, oh no, it's not that. It's not that.
I was right.
Oh no, but it wasn't about that. My question was, is that a very? I mean, this is a whole nother conversation, but
I remember we were talking about like, is that dharmic? You know,
yeah, is that a very dharmic way? The question wasn't to what extent does this man need combating. The question was, is this a very Buddhist form of combat?
Right. So, not to get on that conversation again,
right.
but it feels to me though, with the global resurgence of nativism and nationalism, that's the fundamental question. You know, we are human animals. We're familial, tribal, communal. We have a lot of oxytocin needs, which are, you know, the hormone of belonging and also of love. And so the fundamental question of like, is there any hope for our species seems to be one that's more addressed by dharmic technologies of the self, ways to be less reactive, ways to be a little kinder, 10% kinder, you could say. And so I don't know that I'm looking in a Jewish space for any of those kind of answers, but it's not the rejection or the struggle that's really in part 2 of the book a lot is not something that's live for me now, the way it was. Still plenty of, you know, angry Facebook posts or, you know, maybe, but nothing more than that. It's not on a soul level. And it's you know, I made a choice a few years ago with my partner to enter this new phase of life in which the idea of going on meditation retreat seems like an unattainable luxury, at least for the next couple of years. And so the arena of practice has shifted. But that's what, you know, when I went back to this book, I mean, it was just really sweet. All the adjectives that come to mind are very like, it was soft, it was sweet, it was lovely, it was delicious to come back to that sense of this person who is a seeker and looking with this rigorous doubting eye that still wanted to, like the X-Files, I want to believe that still wanted those experiences, but also was not willing to sacrifice integrity or what I thought was truthfulness at the time. And I really am actually happy to share that with the world and have it out there. I don't think this is my third in a series of 3 books that I don't think a lot of people are going to buy and read necessarily. But you know, but some people are going to love it, I think, and that makes me feel really gratified. That just feels really connected for me.
I would say this could command a larger audience than I think you give it credit for.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Yeah.
As we say.
As you say.
My tradition. Yeah,
in agnostic.
Yeah.
So,
dream on. Yeah.
So, well, anyway, it's out now or will be by the time we post this, right?
Yep.
If I wait,
it is out
if I wait 2 days or what do I? Anyway, it will be out. I guarantee people it will be out by the time they hear this.
Yep. Enlightenment by Trial and Error. Yeah. Easy title to remember. 10
years on the slippery slope of Jewish spirituality, postmodern Buddhism, and other heresies. I didn't have time to ask you what postmodern Buddhism is, but if people want to know the answer to that, they will just have to buy the book. And
or continue listening to you.
And where else can people find you?
I am teaching this Buddhist Jewish meditation retreat in Connecticut at the end of December, and I love that container. It's a very sweet container for people to do pretty difficult, contemplative work. You can find out more about that on my website, jmichaelson.net.
And you must be on Instagram. You referred to that.
I am, actually. I am.
And you're on Twitter, but I'm not sure are you very active on Twitter these days?
My Twitter presence is more the political side and legal side of my work.
Nothing wrong with that. What's your Twitter handle?
There's more. It's at @jmichaelson. I posted today my article about the Supreme Court case today, which was another challenging. Looks like it will be another challenging Supreme Court case, Yeah, I'm still working on the integration of those two careers as I was 3 years ago after the apocalypse in November 2016.
I'm afraid the apocalypse is yet to come, although November 2016 increased the chances of it happening in our lifetime. And I'm at Robert Writer on Twitter, WRIGHTER. So thank you, Jay Michaelson. Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you and connect with the audience as well. Really
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Take care.
All right. Thank you.